Yeah, firstly, Jessica, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in GeoHug. I think it's great. There have been some really, really good presentations. And so when you asked me to present something, I was thinking about what I might be able to come up with that could be a little bit different. And so earlier in my career, I became quite interested in jade. And so whilst this isn't really a high-level technical talk, I hope to give the audience some idea or flavour for the jade trade and what it's worth in Myanmar. So why jade? Well, I've been interested in jade for quite a long time. In the 1970s, I had the opportunity to visit Taiwan, and specifically the Chinquashi high sulfidation gold silver deposit, which was operational at the time. That in itself was extremely interesting, but the person who actually hosted my couple of weeks in Taiwan was a wonderful gentleman who was Professor Li Ping Tan at the National Taiwan University. And so he and I became very good friends over time, but when I was in Taiwan, one weekend he took me to a jade market in Taipei, which was about the size of your average football field, I guess. And there was pieces of jade everywhere. Some were a few dollars and some were millions. And this really captivated my attention because I've always been interested in minerals and a collector. But subsequently also took me to the National Palace Museum in Taipei, where probably the world's most outstanding and valuable collection of jade antiques and artifacts is housed. Straight after the revolution, Chiang Kai-shek, when he fled to Taiwan, took most of the cultural treasures out of China, including jade, to Taipei, and that's currently housed in the National Palace Museum, which to this day is still a major sore point between mainland China and Taipei. So after that, mid-90s to about 2008, I was with Ivanhoe Mines and working in Myanmar, and there was a small window in time where foreigners were able to apply to travel to the north, and so I was able to do that. And as part of that exercise, I spent several days at the jade mines. So that's really the background to my interest in jade. The presentation itself, I've got a few comments about the history, some brief geology, the trade and what it's worth, which I think will be quite an eye-opener, the mining operations at the jade mines in Pakant, which is an even bigger eye-opener, and then some things about comments about the jade business and some closing remarks. So jade goes back a long time, especially in the Chinese culture. You can see there that that's the Chinese character for jade, which is ye. And in the Confucian times, it was a symbol for righteousness and virtue way back then in the Chinese culture. And so it was a valuable stone for the Chinese people way back then. And most of the jade that they held at that time, pre the 13th century, was actually nephrite. And as I'll explain shortly, jade is actually a trade term. It can cover a number of minerals. And so most of that came from northwestern China, but it wasn't jadeite, it was nephrite. And so in the 13th century, a trader from Yunnan, which is neighboring to northern Myanmar, visited where they must have been extracting some jade at that time. And it went back to China, southern China in Yunnan. And so the government at the time sent an expedition into the Kachin state of northern Myanmar to investigate the jade. And so it was clearly obvious at the time to the Chinese that this was an important future source for their jade. And so they annexed the northern part of Myanmar, which is the Kachin state. And so pretty much since that time, they established a trade route that connected the jade mines into China. And then the Second World War came along in 1942. And so that was a cessation of the jade trade per se. And then after the Second World War, we had the Mao period in China. And so the jade trade had to go underground. It was not considered to be the correct thing to do in a communist society. So it shifted to Hong Kong. But then once the post-Mao period was over, the markets more or less totally reopened to what it is today. So in terms of the name jade, the Chinese Emperor Qianlong prized it very much, and particularly the what's known as imperial jade. This is the high quality, rich green color, and it was very important in their feng shui as well as within their culture. But the actual word jade, it's speculated that it actually came from the Spanish in Central America during the Cortez conquest, where there is a jade occurrence. And this was important, obviously, for the Aztecs in the Mesoamerican culture. And that actually came from Guatemala. But so they were using the word Piedra de Jade, which in Spanish means stone daughter. But why daughter, I don't know. But it seems that jade actually was a corruption of Jade. But it wasn't until 1863 when a French mineralogist actually identified the mineral per se, which was a pyroxene, and named it jadeite. So nephrite and jadeite are both called jade. Jade is a trade term, but the actual mineral is jadeite, which is a pyroxene, and nephrite is an amphibole. They can look quite similar, but they're quantum leaps apart in terms of their value. And then George Harlow from the New York Museum, who's been working on jade for decades, he coined the term jadeite, which was a rock that comprised 90% of jade and other high pressure minerals, such as you can see there. As I said, jade is a trade term, and so much of what you hear about or see on the world markets is actually nephrite, and in particular, British Columbia and New Zealand, where there are some wonderful deposits of nephrite. For example, it was really important, and still is, in the Maori culture, and also the Inuit cultures of Western Canada. So we've got two very distinct minerals, both are termed jade. There's nephrite and jadeite, but jadeite is the one that really has the high quality value. Most of it is actually used in utility jewelry, relatively low cost bangles, necklaces, carvings, etc., etc. So 90% of the market is actually what I would call utility jade. It has various colors, which are due to the impurities I've shown there. Jadeite, pure jadeite is actually white, and the top is a piece out of my collection. Black jade, which you can see there is carbon, and then you have mauve, green, and at the bottom is what's the most important, which is imperial green. And that beautiful apple green color is due to chromite. You will note on the right that it is possible to have several colors within the same piece, and that too can be very important for carving and value. The classification of jadeite is really sophisticated, and I doubt whether any Western jewelers or merchants could actually ever come to grips with this. But you can see there are many different classifications for jadeite, and 1A at the top left, which is your imperial green top quality, that actually is worth more per carat than diamonds. Here's the high-end value. It's in obviously jewelry as well as just carvings, etc., in Chinese culture. This is imperial green jadeite set with diamonds. Very nice. Unfortunately, the lady wasn't my field assistant, but you can see there how valuable it can be inlaid there with diamonds. So where does jade actually occur. There are several places around the world. Most are insignificant to just merely a couple of outcrops or occurrences. 99.9% of the world's jadeite comes out of the Kachin state in northern Myanmar at a place called Pakant. There are two other locations where jadeite potentially has commercial significance. That's at Monotagua in Guatemala and Aktogay in Kazakhstan. In fact, the one in Kazakhstan does have commercial production, mostly in an industrial sense and low end, but it may be in the future that they're able to market, if they can find enough of it, some of the high quality imperial. But 99.9% of the current production comes out of northern Myanmar. And so Pakant is located in the Kachin state on the border with India and China. You can see Yangon there. One would fly from Yangon to Mikchila. And then from there, it's a very arduous road journey that takes about 12 hours. Pakant itself is a thriving Wild West boom town. It would have a population possibly of 400,000 or 500,000 people, and it exists solely because of the jade trade. To get there, this was in 2002 when I was able to visit together with Andrew Mitchell. And so the area was held under incredibly tight security. At that time, mostly controlled by the Kachin Independence Organization, who had deals with the Myanmar government. So there were many, many checkpoints, and it actually took, I think, something like 3 months before Andrew Mitchell and myself could get permission to enter the area. We were very fortunate. I mentioned earlier it was a window in time when the government was starting to open up and foreigners could actually travel to some of the areas that previously were off limits. And since that time, I believe it's still extremely difficult for Westerners to visit the mines. And you'll see why probably towards the end of the presentation. It was a challenging drive to get there. I think we averaged something like 10 kilometers an hour for 120 kilometers, but we eventually arrived there. Some local enterprising locals were standing by with elephants to pull one out of trouble if need be. It was quite difficult access. Geologically, the jade mines are at the intersection of a major collisional zone, which has allowed upthrust from deep in the crust of the peridotites, which host the serpentinized peridotites, which host the actual jadeite. It's thought to be probably Cretaceous in age, and the next slide is a little more detail of the geology. This is a beautiful old map that was made by a guy called Chiba, and he was working for the British Geological Survey based out of India. And so at this time, lower and central Myanmar were basically controlled by the British. However, they had very little foothold in the north. But Chiba was able to go up there in the 30s, and he made this wonderful map, which, by the way, still stands today. The two things to note are serpentinized peridotite, which is shown inside the heavy black line. And this is what actually hosts, or was the host rock for the jadeite. And then inside the red line are conglomerates. And so the jadeite has weathered out of the peridotites and into conglomerates, which are probably various ages. Here's a simplified sketch of what I think has been going on. So we have the purple peridotites, which have been thrust up from a depth of as much as perhaps 50 kilometers. They hosted the hydrothermal and metasomatic lozenges of jadeite, which after being upthrust were eroded during several periods of uplift and down drop. And so because jadeite is actually quite hard, it's 6.5 or 6, I think, it's residual, and it made its way into basins with very thick sequences of conglomerates. So what's actually being mined at present, well, ever since mining commenced, is actually a conglomerate. And this has clearly been reworked several times because of the very mature nature of the conglomerate. Here's a photo of the conglomerate. It's fairly typical. And the yellow arrow is pointing to a jadeite boulder in the conglomerate. So this is 25 years ago, and even at that time, there was fairly large-scale mining, artisanal mining, and organized conchies operating to extract the jadeite from the conglomerates. All of that rock type that we're looking at is thick conglomerate, within which there are erratically distributed boulders of jadeite. This is actually very reminiscent of Serra Pelada in Brazil, for anyone that remembers those photos of the gold rush there. So literally tens of thousands of people manually extracting the jadeite. So fast forward another 10 years, and then this became extremely mechanized. Nearly 95% of this would be Chinese equipment and Chinese operated, and the conglomerates are up to hundreds of meters thick. And what we can see here is a long zone, probably 15 kilometers or more, of what were formerly hills of conglomerate that have been systematically stripped and mined in an open cast fashion to extract the jadeite boulders. So this is 15 years ago. Even then it was very large scale open cast mining. Supposedly there were sanctions, but a lot of that equipment is cat. And this is a typical mining operation that we saw in 2002. So an excavator is simply extracting the loosely consolidated conglomerate and then trucking it to a sorting heap, and then people are manually picking out what they think are the higher quality jadeite boulders. So this is a photo I took of the sorting process. These people actually were all Chinese. Nobody here spoke Myanmar, but they would just simply examine the material that the excavator bucket was dropping and pulling aside anything that they could recognize as jadeite. I would say they were quite skilled at this, but it was highly inefficient. And so you will see later how local people are still reworking some of these dumps for the pieces that were missed by these sorting teams. Here's an example of some production from one of the shifts. And so whilst it doesn't look a lot, any one of those boulders could be worth $2 or 2 million, subject to the quality of the jadeite inside those boulders. There are a few occurrences of primary jadeite mineralization, and they're typically jadeite albite veins. There aren't many, but this is one example of a primary occurrence of jadeite and albite, often dike-like bodies and very uncommon. So all the production is coming out of the conglomerates. Every year since about, I guess, the mid-90s, there were auctions held in Yangon for gems, and that included rubies and sapphires from Mogok, pearls, and also jade. By far, the most traded commodity or auction commodity was jade. It would comprise probably 85% of the auction. And these were held every couple of years, twice a year. And most of the time when I was there, I was able to attend because I always found them absolutely fascinating. It was really, really interesting. So at these auctions, they would display boulders of jadeite, which normally had a cut surface, so you could see the quality of what was inside it. Jadeite has an oxide skin, so when it weathers, it forms a brown skin that you can't really see what's inside it. And so at the auction, what they would have is all of these cut slabs. Each slab had a lot number, and these people are all Chinese, basically from Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, mainland China, elsewhere. And so they come to these auctions to bid for blocks and lots of jadeite, which they would then take back to their home country, to a factory, and then process into high-end jewelry, or mostly utility jade, bangles, rings, beads, etc. So thousands of people come in at this time. They fly in a few days before. They pay for a registration. They're given a name tag. And so you can see two gentlemen there who have their registration tags that has a number. And so they spend several days walking around inspecting the blocks. And you can see on the blocks there is a tag, and that actually gives the weight of the jadeite piece and also its reserve price. And so the people that are going to bid for this spend a couple of days walking around, making notes, what they want to bid for. And then at the end of the inspection period, there's a bid. There are some other things that also are put on display. This is a jade-like mineral. It's called cosmochlor, or locally morsitsit. It's quite beautiful, but it's relatively soft and it doesn't have anything like the value of jade, but it is one of the high pressure minerals that sometimes is called jade. So now let's take a look at some of these lots. These are photographs that I took at various stages, but so here's lot number 5778. It's two pieces, it's 326 kilos, and the reserve price, which are all in euros, was 368,000 euros. And so this gives you some idea of the value that's placed on jadeite. One of the important things that the buyers are looking for is not only color, but translucence, because the more translucent a piece of jadeite is, the value escalates dramatically. And so they're all carrying around these little torches and they're checking for translucence. So here's a piece of top quality imperial green, and you can see just how translucent this is and the beautiful apple emerald green color that it has. So a few more lots that were on sale. This is a lovely piece of imperial green. It's 1.7 kilos and the reserve price was 36,000 euros. There's our brown skin over the jadeite boulder, so we can't really see what it is until somebody polishes a little window through the skin to see what's inside. The last thing you would want to do, for example, is cut something like this in half. So what they do is, for the boulders that aren't already have a slice, they make a little window so they can get some idea of what's inside it. Here's a beautiful piece of mauve jadeite. It was actually one of two pieces. The weight was 70 kilos, and that was a reserve price of 48,000 euros. And now we get down to some of the really interesting stuff. Lot number 5488, 16 pieces, half a kilogram, 88,000 euros. And the one on the right, just over half a kilogram, and that's 280,000 euros. Absolutely staggering prices. And so at the end of the inspection period, there's a day when all the bids are collected, the sealed bids are then opened and the winners are announced. I was actually able to attend one of these. And so this is what the bidding area looked like. And the panel there was announcing the successful bids. Once the bids were announced, these were then placed on bid sheets outside the auction area. And there were about 6 of these stands. And so everyone who has submitted a bid can see what whether their bid was successful, and if it wasn't, who got it and what they paid for it. And bear in mind that there's something like 5,000 people who were bidding for the various pieces that were in the auction. And so I was very skeptical about the reserve prices, I have to say. So I photographed one of the bid sheets and then had it redrafted. And this is actually directly from one of the bid sheets. And so it shows the lot number, which was that tag in the display area. Then it had the reserve price, which you can see there, and the actual sale price, and then the person, his registration number, and who bought it. And in every single case in this table, you can see that the sale price exceeded, and sometimes greatly exceeded, the reserve price. And for me, this was absolutely quite staggering. And in the case of Mr. Wong, he really wanted lot 1317, which had a reserve price of 18,000 euros, and he paid 143,330 euros for that lot. So clearly he was very successful in obtaining the lot that he wanted, but it's just a typical example of the prices that were paid for all these lots. And so here's the real showstopper. This is the world's largest known piece of imperial green jadeite that I'm aware of. It's absolutely gorgeous. There isn't any real need for security because you would never get out alive trying to carry this out. And so there's the tag. It's 171 kilos and its reserve price was 80 million euros. This is the largest piece of top quality imperial green that I'm aware of that exists. It's just absolutely outstanding. Now a little bit more about the value. Christie's hold auctions every year in Hong Kong as well as other places, and their Hong Kong auctions normally feature Chinese antiquities and also jade. And so I was able to get a catalogue from 2011, and I started flicking through it, and yes, indeed, there were jade items that were in the catalogue for auction. And so this was one piece, which was actually it's a Qing Dynasty dragon seal button, not much bigger than, say, 2 matchboxes. And that had a reserve price of 1.2 million US for the Christie's auction. This one is even more spectacular. It was a pendant and it was termed the Three Friends of Winter. It possibly had some sort of history, which is also important to the Chinese when they're buying jade. And that was a reserve price of 3.2 million US. That's a little bit bigger than my thumb. So there is an example of the value of high-end imperial green jadeite. When you travel to China, as I'm sure many of you have, and you visit a night market, or you get taken by your hotel driver to a jade shop, they are everywhere. And so this is a photo I took in Xi'an, where there was a jadeite emporium. It was 4 floors of absolutely nothing but jadeite jewelry and products. And it was just one example of many such emporiums throughout the city, not to mention the night markets. If you go to a Chinese night market anywhere in China, there will be stalls or streets that are selling jadeite and nephrite. So it's a very valuable and sought after commodity. Because of that, naturally, there are a lot of fakes, and these can range from plastic to chrysoprase to heat-treated material, to nephrite, etc., etc. So here are 2 pieces. The obvious looking one is a fake, and the real one is the one on the left. So one would really have to know what you're doing if you're buying high-end jadeite, because clearly there's a lot of fakes around, and they look very convincing. So there's been a lot of issues with the jadeite mining in the Kachin State and Arakan because of its tremendous value. There are a lot of illegal activities, most of which are organized by local and Chinese syndicates. There is no health and safety regulations whatsoever, and thousands of people die every year in the jade trade business. Heroin addiction is another huge problem, but you only have to go into something like Global Witness to get a feel for the scale and magnitude of the dark side of this business. In 2015, it was reported that the revenue for just that year was US 31 billion. This was probably very underestimated because, in fact, a lot of jade gets smuggled out, but it just, again, gives you an idea of the staggering value of the jade trade. There's a Google image view from 2020 of the jade workings, and that's a 25-kilometre zone of total and utter open cast mining and devastation. There is no environmental control whatsoever. The local landowners were long since either pushed off their properties or disappeared. And so what you're looking at there is roughly 100 square kilometres of total devastation of uncontrolled open cast mining for jadeite. I'd be really tempted to put something like this over the top of Chuquicamata just for scale. But this just absolutely, it's incredible, the scale and magnitude of this mining operation. And so here's a few scenes of the actual mining activities. This is just one small area of that 25 kilometres. And what you see is just a hive of activity and trucks and open cast mining with excavators. I wouldn't even hazard a guess at what the daily production is over that 25 kilometre long zone. Here's another more recent shot. I would defy anyone to count the number of trucks in this particular image, but you can clearly see the magnitude of the mining that's going on that very few people have ever even heard about. This is just mind-blowing. The local people, there are at least several 100,000 informal miners who are allowed into the area to pick over the dumps. Some are organised, some aren't, and most people are unsuccessful. The lucky ones might find a piece that was missed in the previous mining. It could make them an absolute fortune. It could be the size of a tennis ball, and they've made several $1 million. So that's the incentive. But sadly, most of the poor local people, they come from all over Myanmar to get involved in this simply out of desperation to survive and to provide a livelihood for their families. But here's an example of some of these groups, fairly tightly controlled by the military that you can see there. And they're allowed in at certain times to scavenge the dumps for possible leftover pieces of jade. This is a very sad scene, actually, because there are several 100,000 people involved with this, and most of whom become hooked on a heroin, or they've just totally destroyed their lives. Very, very few are successful. They even work night shifts. Here you can see groups hoping to find something. They're desperate, so they work. There's a night shift, and this is happening all over the jade dumps as well. This is an area of dumps that are being reworked by the informal miners. As I said, some are organised, some are just totally informal and hoping for the best. But at some point, if they find something, they have to go to a middleman who takes most of what they've found. Fatalities. There are, because of zero mine planning or regard to health and safety, landslides are a constant problem. This was in 2015, where more than 200 people died in one landslide. There was a really big one in 2017 where hundreds died. And I think there was one last year too, where hundreds more died, but rarely does one ever hear about this aspect of the jade mining business. So some comments now about it. So in 2014, it was estimated to be worth at least 8 billion. I think that would be a gross underestimate. And it was a 20% increase apparently to 2013. At the time, at the auctions, there were more than 4,000 traders that came in, and there were over 7,000 lots that were sold. The US had an embargo on jade and rubies. However, that made almost zero difference because it all went smuggled out through Hong Kong and China and ended up in Hong Kong, Singapore, and wherever. So it's fair to say that the US embargo had almost no impact at all. As of last year, it's estimated to be worth at least 35 billion. It's probably more than 60% of the GDP of Myanmar, and 80% of the production or more is considered to be smuggled out to Thailand and China, where it then floods into the Western markets and the Chinese markets. There was a massive escalation of the mining prior to the 2015 election, whereby the people that were involved with the jade mining, and there aren't many of them that actually control it, were very nervous about the impact of a potential democracy under Aung San Suu Kyi. And so it really ramped up in 2015. From about 2012, the Myanmar military systematically took over after many conflicts with the Kachin Independence Organization. They eventually got control of the jade mines around 2013 and 14. So from that point on, it was 100% controlled by the Burmese military. As I mentioned, there's widespread heroin addiction, and it is very widespread because heroin is available for the price of a cigarette, and there are many, many fatalities. So obviously we would like to find another jadeite deposit somewhere outside of Myanmar. And as every one of us that's involved with mineral exploration, we all know that it's a very high risk and tough business. So one of the issues with finding another deposit of jadeite around the world, there are places that are geologically favorable, particularly in some of the upthrust ophiolite terrains where you do have high pressure minerals present. And I suspect that with time, eventually other areas or deposits will be found that have high grade jadeite. The biggest single issue probably is the ability to recognize it, simply because of this brown skin that's an oxidation effect that forms over the jadeite. And so when this weathers into the soil profile or into a stream, it's virtually unrecognizable. And I'm not sure if you can see the piece I have here. This is a typical example. And so what one would do is polish through the oxide skin to see what was inside it. And this is quite a good piece of imperial jadeite. So from a prospecting point of view, it's very difficult to recognize it. And this is a photo from a paper by George Harlow from the deposits in Guatemala. And that's actually a very large boulder of jadeite, but as geologists, you and I walking up the stream probably wouldn't pay any attention to it. So it's quite difficult to recognize, which is one of the encumbrances of actually discovering other potential deposits. This was uncovered in 2000 oh, sorry, I've got that wrong. It should be 2017. This is another showstopper. It's a 175-ton boulder of jadeite. I think, as far as I'm aware, it's still sitting there while they figure out what to do with it. But clearly, this is incredibly, incredibly valuable. So a few concluding remarks. There's no doubt the prices of jadeite will escalate, and dramatically, with the increasing Chinese economy, the development of a middle class, and the demand for every Chinese family, particularly the ladies, to have a piece of jadeite. The deposits in Myanmar have a finite life, obviously, and I think that's at the scale of mining that we've just seen. This is going to happen probably in the next few years, unless other conglomerate horizons are found. I think probably they would have already been identified given the importance of it. So as a hedge against inflation, for anyone that knew what they were doing, I would say jadeite would be by far the best, but one would really have to know what they were doing. If one was to discover another high quality deposit outside of Myanmar, I mean, this would be a fantastic asset for any company, and even a big company, simply because of the multi-million-dollar value of that asset. And so with that, I could say good luck and happy prospecting. For those that are interested, there are two books that I can highly recommend. The one on the left is Andrew Mitchell's Bible, published in 2017 on the geology and mineral deposits of Myanmar. Andrew's career in Myanmar spans 50 years. And so this is a fantastic compilation of the geology and mineral deposits of Myanmar. Highly recommended for anybody interested in that topic. And on the right is another recently published book, and it's The Hidden History of Myanmar. This is a no-holds-barred about the political events in the last 20 or so years. And the author, Tan Mint Yu, is actually the grandson of the former UN Secretary General, U Thant. For those of my vintage, you'd remember him from the 60s as a wonderful gentleman who was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So those two books I would highly recommend if you wanted to follow up on some of this. And so with that, thank you very much. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Does it require reworking into a conglomerate or a sedimentary rock to be economic, do you think? Or
yes, I would say so, almost certainly, John, because the occurrences of the primary are so erratic, and it would take a lot of uplift and weathering to release anything like the amount of jadeite that's now in that conglomerate. So I suspect the uplift, and it was probably just post Cretaceous, and it was ongoing over several periods, and probably up and down movements for kilometers to be able to form that mature, very thick conglomerate. It's a couple of 100 meters thick actually, and so and it's now standing up as a high, but obviously it was a major valley, and these jadeite boulders, as they weathered, were pouring into this I guess half graben or whatever it was at the time, and really it's a unique geological situation. So there's a group, and I don't know if Kevin's on this webinar, but there's a group, Kevin Fu, there's a group in Kazakhstan who are actually mining a primary deposit, and that's two big, from what I can make of it, I haven't had the opportunity yet to go there, it's two big lozenges of jadeite that they're actually managing to mine as a primary deposit. Whereas the stuff in Guatemala, as far as I'm aware, is all boulders.
There can't be many situations in the world where you get that coincidence of major structures and so on.
Yeah, you're right. The places I would go, actually, to be honest, if I was in my 20s and was looking to make a fortune, I'd go to the Papuan Ultramafic Belt, and I'd go to parts of Indonesia.
Yeah, no, that's a fair comment. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the dream would be, to find one of these deposits, prove that it had imperial green, IPO it in Canada, and retire forever.
Doug, if you were 20 again and you know what you know now, would you in fact go looking for jadeite?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely I would. Yep, and there's actually, I can share this with you. Hopefully someone much younger than me might follow it up later. But I found old Dutch reports, and they're in Dutch actually, from early work done in Indonesia. And so there was a Dutch geologist who found, and it was a petrologist, and verified that he'd found jadeite in Indonesia. And so I actually, years ago, I came across this, and I was halfway through organising a helicopter to go into the area when an ethnic riot broke out in the exact place I wanted to go, which was in Sulawesi. And so that was the end of that. And then I left Indonesia and basically just shelved it. But I was very keen to go into the area. And what I was thinking, John, was how to prospect for this. It's very difficult, but I was thinking to start out with, given I knew the area it was supposedly from, was to do a stream sediment sampling survey for the heavies, and then have those examined petrologically for high pressure minerals, including jadeite. And I was thinking that might lead me up to where it was coming from.
Yeah, we've got some questions coming through the chat. So it was noticed there were no Westerners at the auction with 4,000 or 5,000 Chinese bidders. Are they banned from attending? Is the US sanction still?
No, they aren't, but it was necessary to apply for, what's the right word? I had to register, and I had very close Burmese friends that were able to register me to attend. You're quite right. In hindsight, I think I was the only Westerner at those auctions, and I used to go to them quite a bit. I actually got to know some of the guys that they had their lots, and they used to bring in other minerals for me, topaz and stuff like that. But yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I never really considered that. I don't think. I mean, the auctions themselves were quite transparent. There would no real reason why a Westerner wouldn't be able to attend, but certainly to visit the mines, that's a totally different story. And in fact, even as far as I'm aware, and especially the last week, all of northern Myanmar is pretty much off limits to foreigners, Westerners. Chinese can go wherever they want.
Doug, I've got a much simpler question for you. You've obviously carried on something that was very apparent earlier in your career of collecting things. How often do you move house?
Well, I haven't for quite a while, Michael. I did have a large rock collection, and some of that's behind me. But
that prompted the question.
Yeah, it all ended up in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. So I actually don't have a lot of material now at the moment. But I did have a large collection, and to answer your question, I actually constructed a 2-story house to house my collection, which was quite substantial. And now I can move house if I want to. I'm still collecting. I've tried therapy. That didn't work.
Well,
Is there other things like, I don't know, I'm just sad to hear that it's such a big part of their GDP and you feel that it will be exhausted in just a few years? Like, are there other things that are attractive in Myanmar that could be developed on? Or
Yeah, there are, Jessica. There's very large gas fields. There are extremely large tin tungsten deposits which are waiting to be developed at some stage. When I was with Ivanhoe, I was involved in a copper deposit, which is the largest copper mine on mainland Southeast Asia. That's called Moniwa. And that is still going, although probably at the rate that's being mined, it's good for another 10, 15 years maybe. But I think their real future is probably oil and gas, and most likely tin and tungsten in the mineral sector. Tourism has huge potential if they ever got, if it was a different political environment. Yeah. It's a wonderful country. The people are fantastic. It's got a huge amount to offer for tourism.
But no, that was fantastic. So thank you so much. That was so interesting